Welcome to Full Stack Business Owner. Today, we are answering questions from you. Not you, Charlie. No. The listeners, the audience, the community. This is where we actually pick up your questions and answer them. Now, if you want your questions answered, there's two ways to do it. First one is head over to Facebook and join the Facebook group, which is called Full Stack Business Owner Community. Ask your questions, we'll pick them up, answer them on the podcast. And the second way is just hitting reply to Charlie's newsletter emails. All you need to do is ask him the questions, we'll pick it up and we'll answer them here. Now, before we dive into these questions, let's cue your infamous disclaimer, Charlie.
Charlie here from Full Stack Business Owner. I need to let you know that Grant, myself, and the Full Stack Business Owner team are in no way, shape, or form qualified to give you financial advice or pick investment products. We highly encourage you seek out and engage the use of professionals when making financial decisions or comparing investment products.
All right, Charlie. Now, we've been friends for a while, and there's just been one question. It's burning in the back of my mind. That's the whole time I'm just sitting there. I was talking to Hazel. I'm like, what is this? What is this? I am very curious. How big is your emergency fund? But more importantly, do you actually know how to use it? I practiced that delivery.
I was going to say, what a lead-in question. You might have to ask my wife.
I was going to say, oh my God, I don't know if we can talk about that.
No, we want to keep it fun and bubbly on a very topic that isn't that fun and bubbly at time. Like this is like, who really wants to talk about this side of business, do they? Like it's much more fun to talk about the growthy stuff, isn't it?
It is. Man, marketing, sales, it's like money's always more fun when you're making it.
Wholeheartedly agree. But this is a topic that's actually very close to my heart, and I think it's a very important one. And I'm going to go there straight out of the gate. But when I was growing up, unfortunately, my father, who was a business owner, had a workplace accident, and on the back of that didn't have appropriate emergency funds, let's say, in place. And then when his accident occurred and he couldn't go back to work, he was in a very challenging circumstance, and it put an immense amount of financial stress on my home. Now, after experiencing something like that personally, my view on emergency funds is very, very different than someone that's never had financially harder times. Now, I see this pretty apparently today that if a business owner's never experienced it, they do not set up appropriate buffers, or they don't have appropriate emergency funds, and they really don't even have a context to think about it because they've got no pain association. Yep. Where for me, I'm like, I will say this is something where, and I think you've even mentioned this to me, is you've said you're overly conservative in a lot of ways.
Very much so.
Yeah, well, this is where it comes from. This is something where it's like, for me, after having that experience, is that I require, and it is a requirement, I'm using very specific language here, a certain amount of emergency fund to be prepared to weather any potential storms. Now, I'll go further than this though, because in the case of what happened to my father, that was very unusual, right? That's not time specific in any way. Like, I realize all of us could walk out our door today and, I hope not, but get hit by a bus.
Yep.
So there are those types of things you need to be prepared for, but I'll go even further. If you look back in the last 100 years, just in the world economies or so, like they've always gone through cycles. Mm-hmm. There's always peaks and troughs and bulls and bears, and like the market moving and changing is a part of it. And don't quote me on these exact dates, but it's like if you look to like every 7 to 10 years roughly, there's some sort of big economic change. So it was like GFC, we've just had one, and then it was like the .com boom, yep. Right? So there's a few of them that go back there. So as business owners, like I look at that and go, we know this happens. We know it isn't a if, it's a when.
Yeah.
So knowing that, let's just plan for it. Let's get it out of the way. Let's be prepared so when those times come, this isn't something where we get potentially wiped out, which has massive consequences, especially in Australia. So like bankruptcy in Australia is way more serious than the US. Yep. But then the other side of it is like it also presents opportunities to thrive. Like it might actually be the best version of your business if you're set up to weather those types of storms. And I just would say, I'll go as far to say this as well. Every good business owner I know, every one of them has measures in place to weather storms. They really do. I'm yet to find one that I would consider really savvy and well planned that didn't.
do you think that's because they've had to weather a storm before? Because it's like for younger business owners, right? The people that might have been doing business for 5 years, maybe 10 years, right? Just sort of pre-COVID kind of thing, which actually was really good for a sort of a lot of organizations where they haven't seen that pain. Their family might not have gone through something like you've been through. Do you think this is more of a, I've seen the pain of when that happened, so now I've just got the cuts on my back to understand, hey, I need some emergency funds? Or does this come from like another place of them just going, I'm now completely aware of these peaks and troughs, and sometime is going to be a trough, and I'm acutely aware of that, and I just need to put something away?
I would say that in my experience from what I've seen is that dealing with challenge and hardship is a skill.
Yep.
You would see that people that have experience doing that weather them much easier, where someone like who's never gone through a downturn or never seen economic situations changed is they're noticeably more stressed. And I'll give an example to articulate it. If you're driving your car to a place you've never been before, do you ever notice like how assertive you are to like, did I just miss the street?
Yep.
What's the speed limit? Do I need to be in this lane? Versus like if you're going to a place you've been to hundreds of times, maybe a parent's house, it's like you just all driving home from business or work, you can almost forget the drive. You're on autopilot.
Yep.
I would say it's the same here. I would say business owners that aren't adequately prepared to deal with challenge, hardship, economic change, they feel it. But that's part of the process of like, everyone had to drive that road the first time. So it's part of building your full stack of skills, shameless plug, of like being a good business owner. Like I don't know a business owner you can't be a business owner that's only successful in the good times.
Yeah.
It sounds like a pretty shitty recipe for success, right? You need to be able to thrive in both environments. You need to have skills to support being a good business owner in the boom and the bust, in the ups and the downs.
And not necessarily just because of the market going boom and bust. Like I even had a very good friend of mine who bought quite a few properties. He leveraged himself up, and then his business actually had a bit of a downturn. And it was just not market related. It was just they just didn't generate as many leads and sales. And they actually went and sold some of their investments at a fire sale, which is like, I'm talking like blocks of land at 50% off, just to go and inject that cash back in their business. And there was no marketing forces there. It was just unexpected things that happened in the business, like people leaving, etc. And they're just like, wow, I wish I had some kind of emergency fund to support me through this, not just waiting for like a big sort of economic impact. But it's interesting. When you look at an emergency fund, so economic impact can come through and you can have some sort of businessy thing. Is it the concept of an emergency fund just to get you over like a month of operation, just until I'm back on my feet? Like, hey, if I lose a couple of big clients, do I just need enough money to get me back on my feet? Or is this more of a, okay, no, you need to think about this completely differently, as opposed to, I back myself, Charlie. I can sell things, I can market things. I know I can make money. I just need enough money to support me until I go and make it? Or is there another concept or another approach that you think that we should be thinking about this in?
I view it in two ways. I think there's an emotional side to it, like what do you need to sleep at night? And then I think there's a logical side to it, is like what does the maths tell us versus like the skill sets and networks and all the things we have. And I've certainly looked at both of these pretty heavily here. And I would almost say there's like another layer, but I'll bring this up later where I want to talk about something else that's attached to this. Is like logically, I spent some time and looked at like, okay, if there is a big recession, how long do they normally last? Like what's the average? And just for anyone out there is 2 years. Now that doesn't mean you're going to make no money in that 2 years.
Yep.
But the idea being that if economic downturn comes, is on average, that's the span of a recovery. So I would look at that and go, well, as a business owner, if I know that's the average, what needs to be in place so I can make it through a 2-year span? So that's the logical argument. The emotional one, though, is that if you look at it and go, well, if, again, it's like I look at my bank account, it's like how much needs to be in that bank account for me to feel safe?
Yep.
Well, that doesn't factor in how long a recession is at all. That's a much more personalized approach. And I would encourage, like I did, people to acknowledge both. Like in this case here, I know you're way more aggressive than I am with buffers and emergency funds.
Yep.
And you operate at a level that's fine. Like you're not losing sleep at night because of how much is in your bank account. And if we swapped bank accounts, I probably wouldn't sleep.
Yeah.
So that's where I look at it and go, like, you have to acknowledge these multiple layers. The other side of it is partners. So, like, for example, is like if you, let's say your partner is very risk adverse and conservative, maybe she needs to see more money in a bank account to feel safe and secure versus you. So you might have to have some extra in there so that your home environment is stable. Because the last thing you would want is, let's say, recession comes and you're coming into your home every night and then your partner's panicked about
Freaking
money
out.
and that's becoming infectious on you. So there's an extra layer towards that.
Yeah, I find that second point so powerful because even one thing for you in business, I know that you swing for the fences because you've got such great sort of backup emergency funds, right? Because let's go and take the opportunities that are actually going to create the most or generate the most or open more doors, etc. Which is sort of one of those things that only people who have got that backstop or that safety net will take the swing at, because it's like, well, I have a huge amount of abundance. Now everything else is just an opportunity on how can I increase my value on top of exactly what I'm doing. One of the interesting points that I look at, so a lot of people that I've had a conversation to around their emergency funds think about the direct household only, right? They look at, well, can I pay the mortgage? Can I pay the bills? Can I buy food? Can I do all these things? And how long can I do that for? So easiest calculation is how much do you spend every single month and then X months, right? So it might be, I don't know, they might think of it like in 6 months as an example. So they go, cool, spend 10 grand a month, 6 months, I need $60,000 as an emergency fund. But then when I ask them a little bit more, I'm like, well, what emergency funds do you have in the business? If the business doesn't do well, but what about the emergency funds that you've got against your properties, if you've got investment properties? Like this concept of not just one bucket of money to support your household, like that's not what I'm leading towards. I'm going, how do I have the buckets across everything? Where is my emergency fund for my personal life? Where is my emergency fund for the properties? Where is the emergency fund for business? So that I know that any one of those could be going through a storm without impacting someone else, right? Like my business could be being impacted, which is then impacting my house life, but my properties could be going great. And I'm like, well, it doesn't matter. So I'm like, as long as I got the emergency funds in those two, not the third, I'm fine. Like, is there, from your perspective, do you play it in those similar silos, or is that just a me and I'm a weirdo? Or how do you sort of think about that?
No, I combine them. I absolutely combine them. So again, we'll just use an example here. We've just been through this like pandemic era where a lot of businesses got shut down for like potentially 6 months if they're in Victoria, right? So the idea of that there can't be a long span where you might have zero income, I think we just have to, it's not a 0% chance.
Yeah. It exists.
It exists. It very much exists. And it's like to be able to ride that through is the difference. Mm. And to your story about earlier, right, with your, I don't know if it's a friend or acquaintance, but someone you know that is had to fire sale something, right? That's the stuff you want to avoid because that can undo like years of hard work. Like that's the stuff that can really set you back or potentially even wipe you out. So that's like what we're working against in that reign. Now for myself, and this is again for me, I'm just saying what's worked for me, is that I look at it and go, well, my business, my personal, and in this case, my properties need to all be factored into this buffering.
Yep.
You can't silo it to what you're spending in your home because let's say you've got $100,000 siloed in your personal life. It's like, cool, I'm buffered for 6 months. Oh shit, business has got no income. You're just going to take that money and have to use it in the income and then you've destroyed your personal buffers.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I definitely layer it up and that increased the size of the buffer I need immensely. It really did.
Now, I know that you reckon I'm aggressive when it comes to these things let's be honest, I get a little bit of an ego.
Aggressive. I wouldn't sleep at night. I'll put it there. Like this is one of the areas where I think we are very different and clearly like different life experiences. But you, to go further than that though, you're way more aggressive in buffers. But I would say I'm more aggressive in business because I look at that and go, well, the reverse of that is because I feel very secure in the amount of buffers, like I'm willing to be more risky and swing for the fence in business, where if you kind of get this interesting like trade-off in psychology when you look at the two. I don't think there's a right or wrong. It's just that awareness to it and intention plays a role here.
Yeah. And it actually leads to some very good conversations, especially when we know that level of detail of each other. And so for myself, like I look at going how, and I'm happy to be transparent here, like how do I have at least 6 months in personal life 6 months in business and 6 months in all properties to weather any storm. Now that's
sorry, I need a second. But this will just show my character. I would lose the rest of my remaining hair. Like, I'm impressed you have such
it's all fake. That's what it is. No,
look how happy relaxed you look right now. I'm like,
I feel great. Stressed out. And it was funny because I remember when we talked about this, you're like, man, I'd freak out. And I guess it must come from elsewhere. And so I started looking at this going, okay, well, why am I happy to be so aggressive? And now those things exclude the fact that I've got some good equity in other businesses that are doing quite nicely. But I'm like, where am I factoring this stuff in? And I look at how have I put emergency buffers into things before I've got it in. And so I'm going to explain this to see if it calms you down. Right. So if you think about properties, right, there are people who go and buy investment properties with like 5% deposits, 10% deposits, etc.
I'm not going to make it through this episode.
Just sweat. Just sit there and just sweat. And so for me, I'm just like, great. Well, I just need to make sure that I have at least 20% deposit on all of the properties, that they're all cash flow positive, and to an extent of being cash flow positive, of being able to weather interest rates increases or no tenants in there, etc. Plus, on top of that, the 6 month buffer, which means I've got the lever to say, well, maybe I don't tenant it for 6 months, or maybe the interest rates go up for like stupid amounts, which even then, if the interest rates go up slightly, then my 6 month buffer will go for a longer period of time. The 6 month buffer is if I've got zero income, like the house has fallen down, I still got to pay for everything. So I look at that and I go, well, there's buffers already in play prior to me getting in. Business is similar. So I look at businesses that we operate and I go, well, how do I factor in profit margins in there? Where even if we lost a couple of clients, etc., there's still profitability. Like, it's not going to go from, major clients cancelled. Now we've got zero profitability and we're going to start firing people. It's like, no, we've still got profitability. We've still got a strong team. All we just need to do is go and find someone else to replace that client. Right. And I go, cool. Well, there's still buffers there.
Yeah, you can de-risk other assets. You can de-risk things. So in that example there, that's a great one, right? If you've got one client that's 80% of your business, if they were to leave and it sent you heavily unprofitable, right, that is like a big risk. So like, rather than just having like reserve cash, having a second client of that caliber might be the best de-risk you do here, or the best buffer you create.
Yep. And then I just go and do the exact same thing for my personal life. Like, we don't have like cars completely paid in cash. Like, anything that we kind of splurge on a little bit is rent, but like, I can dial most of that stuff down to the extent that I know I can make that kind of money. Like, I'm not too worried about it.
You can always cancel a lease for financial hardship if it really came down to it, right? You have the option to rent a cheaper property in that circumstance if required.
Yeah. And so I look at that and I go, man, 6 month buffer. Not only that, like right now I've got more than that. I'm just looking at the next opportunity to go running at. But I'm just like, like this is fine. I can continue playing this game. But to your point, Charlie, did my family go through financial hardship when we were growing up? No, like sure, like normal parents, right? They're like, oh man, fucking credit card bill or these bills and stuff like that. But I've never seen stuff like that. Yeah, go.
If you got desperate, like really desperate, could you ring your parents and borrow money?
Yeah, of course. Like I have not been born with a silver spoon in my mouth, but I'm very, very fortunate that like my whole family, like they've done well. They're not like multi-millionaires, but I know I could call them up and get out of most situations that I'd ever get into.
See, I don't have that at all. Like there's no parental, and again, I love my parents dearly. I'm not trying to shape them in any way in this conversation, but it's like if I said, hey mom, I need 100 grand, like she doesn't have 100 grand to give me.
Yeah.
So it's like for myself, that's another factor. Like you may be able to do that, and I'm not saying you can, but like maybe that is again a consideration on why your risk tolerance is different than I.
Yeah, and I also related to the point that I don't think even me personally in my 30 plus years on this earth, like I've never had a financial problem. Any business I wanted to start, any business I wanted to invest in, anything I wanted to do, okay, no worries. Like we'll just dive in there. Like don't get me wrong, I've overcapitalized in some businesses where I didn't have as much money in my bank account that I wanted to and stuff like that. But I'm just like, So I guess what I'm trying to say is I look at it going, there's a couple of parts to this emergency fund for me anyway. So cash in a bank account that is liquid is one across the silos of business, personal, property, etc., depending on your situation. And then the other one is, well, what risk mitigation tactics did I take before I actually did it? Like, I'm not going to go, great, let's go and pick up all the cash that I've got and just go and jam it into something and have like nothing left over. It's like, no, I invest over and above the cash reserves I've got. I go and invest in things that I know that there's already a buffer in there, etc. But I am curious, like you're freaking out about my 6 months.
I am. I still am.
So what about you? Like, if you turn around and say, I got 7 months, I'm going to slap you.
Do you know what? It's like, I feel like, when you see someone who smokes cigarettes and they justify to you why it's okay for them to smoke cigarettes. I feel like that was you with like your 6 months.
I feel like I did well.
No, you actually did really well. That was strong justifications. And like, at least you've put some thought into it, right? It's the people that have put no thought into this or are running immense debts, have tax debts, credit cards. And it's like, this is the stuff where they get improportionately hit. I will say when you're starting a business, right, there is the very real risk of like you have too much of a buffer and you underinvest in the business and you don't end up successful as well, right? Which is why this is such an interesting topic. So I will reference, if you're in the first few years of business, like building buffers and emergency funds for this level might be very difficult. But once you get to a point, is like you absolutely want to pay more attention to it and increase them over time.
Yep.
All right, you ready? You want to hear my buffers?
Kind of not. I feel like we should go to the next topic. But no, go.
All right. So I will say that I've increased these proportionally as business has gone on, but like I'm well over 3 years.
Across everything?
Across everything. I would say it's probably even closer to 4 if I had to guess right now.
Swing for the fences now.
Well, that's what it opens up. So when I have that amount of buffer is like my risk tolerance to making moves in business has opened up substantially for that. It also means that I will never take on a client or project I don't want to.
Yep.
So one of the reasons we've been able to do this podcast, like in the whole full stack thing without going, it's got to make money today, is because we have adequate reserves to do so. Like it doesn't need to be something that produces cash from day one, which I think limits a lot of business owners. The next thing I'll mention here, you brought this point up just a touch before, is like, I would say that one of the things in knowing that I don't have easy access to capital around me from, let's say, mum in this example, knowing that doesn't exist has definitely made me much more self-reliant. There are pros that come from that as well. Yep. Now, I will share a view on like why I've let my buffers increase a little bit more here, because I'm sure there's people out there going, this is ridiculous. Like you could do more with them. Like I'm not sure this is the aspiration for everyone. So for myself, like I've reached a point in my life now where I've got a good level of investments, I've got a good business, I've got strong buffers. So the idea of just adding on risk for the sake of adding on risk is just like, why?
Yeah. What are you risking? It's not worth it.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense for me to go, do you know what? I'm going to lever up. I'm going to take my whole portfolio to 95% LVR and like just buy. And I'm like, the risk reward on that is just silly. Yep. The other thing that I am astutely aware of is that we mentioned before about the idea of that there's these recessions that come up every like 7 to 10 years, might be longer, might be shorter, where there's this 2-year period. Now, when I look to that 2-year period, I'm sitting here and going, well, it's interesting that surviving the 2-year period of a potential like, recession or downturn is one thing, but this is also where people like Warren Buffett make outsized returns. Because there's people that are selling assets much more cheaply. So wouldn't it be interesting that if I was in a position at this stage where it's like, if a downturn comes, I'm not sitting here going, I've just got to make it through, but I'm actually sitting here watching where is the opportunity? Like maybe I am the person that buys your friend's property for 50% off, and that's where I'm going to be able to create a really good upside. And can I share a little story on this one as well?
Of course you can.
Yeah, so when the pandemic hit, this was something where I actually got a bit of experience with this. So at the start of this, and even telling this now, I'm like, I can't believe this is a real story. I had adequate buffers back then. Like I had really strong buffers in my life when this whole pandemic thing kind of started. And I was actually hunting for property at that time. Now, I was very fortunate that we had a really good team around us and all the rest of it. And this is not financial advice by any means as well, right? This is just a story of what happened. But there was a house that came up for sale that was in a really good location. That was a development project, and it was like they wanted 900 and something thousand for it. We put in an offer for 800, and it got accepted at like 830 or 820. right? And it was like because they were panicked to get out. So it was already at a discount.
Yeah.
Right. So being able to like buy really well in that time and weather through what was coming, because I knew this stuff would end, right? The world would work it out. I'm an eternal optimist. If you look at what the humanity has overcome in the last hundreds of years, it's like we seem to always work it out, and I would prefer to live in that frame than being a doomsdayer.
So you're not going to open a media company, a mainstream media company?
I don't know. I'll leave it on the shelf for another day. But those opportunities is where, like, that property I bought particularly is one that has delivered a hugely outsized return because I bought it for such a good price in that environment. And like that is where I think significant opportunity is for me going on. So I'm going to be a little bit more patient, have those reserves, have those buffers. And I'm going to go as far as saying past having an emergency fund, having an opportunity fund.
I think that's a great point because I am going to ask you a second question on that. But before I do, I wholeheartedly agree. So like for me, I must have 6 months buffers in everything before I start going opportunity fund, which is sort of one of those points of me saying, hey, like that's what I need. And there is still more there because I know I was even talking to you about some opportunities that I'm looking at before this. But having that as the base and then having that opportunity fund is just incomparable. Now, I'm gonna frame this up in a bit of a story. So imagine that this killer opportunity pops up, right? And it could be whatever. It could be 500,000, million, 5 million, 10 million. Doesn't really matter. How far would you drain into that couple of years? Like what would be your absolute bare minimum of an emergency fund be?
I would still think it's going to be 2 years for me.
Still 2 years?
Yeah, 2 years is where I'm going to call it. But again, that comes with a level of like stage of business. If I was a startup and I'm trying to grow, it's like that's just inconceivable. That's not a good decision. You would be limiting growth. You would be limiting hiring. Like you got to back yourself at some point in the journey.
That's it. Isn't that interesting? So yeah, I like that concept of that sliding scale. Like if you're starting out, just think about it could be a 1 month buffer. It could be a 1 week buffer. Everything's dependent upon yourself and your expenses and your investments and all these kind of things. But just understanding as you start growing, or the term that I use when I talk about you, Charlie, as you mature in your investments journey.
I don't ever be referred to as the mature one. Don't ever.
Well, I'm the happy one. Yeah. So as you grow, the risks that you're taking, the impact that it could have on other assets, other investments, etc., are just going to be greater. Because as you have a bigger business, the swings, the peaks and troughs will impact you more. As you've got more assets, the peaks and troughs will impact you more, right? And so just looking at that through that maturity curve of going, great, we could go 1 month and then 2 months and then 3 months and then 4 months and then 5 months, etc., as it continues to extend because of the risk profile that you're trying to protect as well as opportunities you're trying to open. I think that is just a powerful point.
Yeah, well, if you're Uber or Amazon, it makes zero sense when you're trying to get mass market appeal to go, no, we've got to have cash buffers. Like that's like you're trying to get your company off the ground. But if you're them today, I would say cash buffers, profitability, these type of things are way more important for a company at that stage.
Yeah, I love that. Now, in a similar sort of topic to emergency funds and the concept of opportunity funds, which I love, some people have been asking, and that question actually came from the community, which was like, okay, well, we talk business and property and stuff, but the direct question was like, the concept of staying in your lane versus diversification, primarily around business, investments, etc. Right? Like there is this concept around, you got to diversify, put eggs in all these baskets as opposed to all your eggs in one basket. Like, what is your thoughts around that? And we'll put the framing of like business and investments as well.
I laugh because I'm just gonna like. I wonder if this is you as well. This is a lesson learned through experience and pain, not from. Like just read it in a book and go, that makes sense. Did you ever like when I finally got some success in business, right? So let's say like after a few years of like, really grinding it out, I finally got something working and started making money. And do you know what the outcome of that was?
You went and invested in like another business?
It made me dumb to think that I was good at all business. Yeah. So it's like one successful business, I'm instantly going to be great at another business. And I actually got involved in another company, right? So it's like I had cracked, we'll call it digital services, it was an agency. I'm going, this is going really well. I know how to generate leads. Like, wow, this can apply anywhere. So because I'm good at this, that means I should go and get involved in, which I won't name the business. I'm just going to use an example that does it. I should start a cafe because I am like, I'm hitting a bit here. You should see what I'm going to do to the cafe industry, right? If I can do this, I can do it. And it was just ridiculous. And I became very, very quickly aware that as I went into this other business model, that's like, this doesn't translate.
Mm-hmm.
The things that I know, like for example, digital services, like to scale, you practically only need staff and software. To scale a cafe in this example, food ordering, supply chains, logistics, maybe like compliance. So a very, very, very different environment, and it made me realize that, hang on, you've cracked a little fraction of the world, not the world.
Yeah, and I went through that in Spain. I still remember going to like business events when I was like studying at university and before I really sort of dove into business, and everyone's like just kind of focusing on the one. Like, don't get, what do they call it? The shiny object syndrome. Like, just don't get sort of pulled in. Like, just focus in on the one. And I remember sitting there, I'm like, it's only because these guys don't understand the value if they have multiples. Like, so I'm like, so similar. Like, I opened an agency, did very well as an agency. And I'm like, I can totally do this anywhere else. So I opened e-com stores. I got involved in like an executive coaching business. Then stepped into my massive realm of SaaS. And I'm like, it's all business. What are you talking about? And so I jammed all of the profits that I'd made into all of these other businesses because I'm like, I've got systems, I got processes, I got team that I can just scale this up for. And it's just like, it's completely different. You're just like, and this was the point. It's like, okay, well, now I get it. Only because I went through that pain myself, as opposed to being like, because I was that naive child that just did not just listen to what other people are saying. So I've been there, I've done that, and it has actually made me a better entrepreneur now, which is great. But I'm like, it took me a little bit to figure that out.
Well, this is where I think we should bring up an important point. If you said to me, okay, sticking your lane versus diversification for making money, I think that you really want to treat that very differently than the idea of going, well, sticking your lane versus diversification for skill. Right. So I would make the argument, like I actually learned a lot from this experience, and it sounds like you did as well, of like doing a different business, but it was a terrible financial decision.
Horrible.
Yeah. So like there are things to look at. And even in our brand, once again, shameless plug, is like in the representation of what full stack is, we're actually saying that you need to develop the full stack of skills to be a good business owner that builds wealth in your business and outside your business. The framing I've really been thinking about more and more, it's like, if you're going to stick your lane, it's like, how do you define how wide the lane is? Right? And it's like, to the point is like, if you're an agency owner and in this example, let's just pretend someone's really good at Facebook ads, right? For them to pick up and implement Google ads, right? I'm going to say that's in the lane. That's just widening the lane a little bit. That might actually be a really great way for you to add immense profit and scalability to that business. But if you're an agency owner and you go, look, I'm going to put a cafe downstairs, right? I would say that's a completely different business model.
Fundamental. Completely different freeway to a completely different destination.
Completely. So that's in the business sense though. I also would make the point and argument that this applies to investing. Like I have certainly seen people go about investing, and it's like they might be really, really good. I'm just going to make these up. And again, it's like for thought and consideration is like they might have like implemented a property development strategy really well. Excellent property developer. But for them to go home at night and then start day trading shares, it's like I would think that's a bit of a stretch. And maybe someone's doing it and it's not a stretch for them and like good on them. But for the average person, I would say that's a ridiculous idea, where it's like for that same person, if they're great at developing property and that's their wealth strategy, maybe it's developing different property or changing from residential to commercial might be their edge. So that definition of like lane width versus like blatant stupidity when it comes to diversification, I think is a really important factor here.
I always think about like why. So a lot of the topics that we cover here, I'm always like, why do people do that? Why don't people think about emergency funds? Why do people think that if you're good at one business, you'll be good at all businesses? Why do people think that if you're just investing, it's a good thing? And I think the unfortunate thing is that there's just always this roll up to a catch-all phrase. It's like, do you do business and do you invest? And like, yes, I business and yes, I invest. Unfortunately, it doesn't actually break down the concepts of going, okay, well, no, there are completely different subcomponents under each one of those concepts, which unfortunately is like when you do a business degree at university, they don't tell you that, hey, by the way, if you're running an agency, it's very different to a guy running like a SaaS or a software company. Like the skills you need and the way you market and the way you sort of tell stories are very different. But the same with investments. Like if I go and talk to family or friends, they're like, oh, you just need to invest your money. What does that mean? What does that mean? And so they don't dive deeper into okay, well, everything is fundamentally different. They all have a different way of being successful and the markets are different. The way they talk is different. And I always look at that going, yeah, that's where people need to understand breaking through that barrier. And for me, like, unfortunately, the way that I learned that lesson was a little bit of failure and school of hard knocks, if you will. But I just go, yeah, that's been the biggest gap of me going, wow, I just can't live off these sort of macro terms of just business and investments. I have to understand. And it's not even, to me, it's not even shares and property. It is like, okay, what are the things that sit underneath it, right? Because there are still some property opportunities that I probably just would not get into because I just don't know enough about them.
Completely.
And I just go, and so I'm like, I know enough about this whole residential investments and stuff like that. I know of like commercial and I know of like developments and things, and I know enough to be dangerous. But would I go and dive deep into those investments to the extent that I think that I can guarantee my success? Not yet. I just need to do some more conversations. I might even need to dabble my toe in, see what it looks like and just sort of mitigate it. But similar to business, can I run SaaS companies? Yes, I can. Can I run agencies? Yes, I can. Why? Only because I did the school of hard knocks and I've seen them all. It's just, would I do that if I was starting out again? No, I'd stick to one and I'd master that one. And that's the lane that I'd stay in. And I'd just, to your point, I'd just make the freeway have 4 lanes instead of 2 lanes and then 5 lanes and just go, great, how can I kind of push the gutters out?
I think, it's pretty apparent in the podcast where I've been successful is like digital services and then residential property. And I look at that and go, like, I would say it's diversified in ways. I mean, they're very, very different. I mean, one's invisible, can't touch it. And the other one's very physical, can touch it. But it's as you add more layers of complexity, even if you're calling it diversification, I think you have to be very aware of that. And we'll just use an example here. It's like the idea of like residential property even versus commercial property. Like there's so many nuances in the finance and leasing that goes into that I would think that you would want to spend a fair amount of time getting educated in both. You wouldn't want to treat them as the same. Treating them as the same would be incredibly dangerous.
Yep. And the point that I want to make on this as well is just because it says stay in your lane does not mean that you can't cross over to a different highway, to a different destination. Not at all. It just needs to be that logical decision to say, I am going to go from this freeway over to that freeway. And you've got to do the work to go, okay, well, how am I going to get across there? How am I going to understand? And how am I going to go from 1 lane to 2 lanes to 4 lanes to 5 lanes so that I can understand it?
I'm just laughing as you say that. I'm like chuckling along here because it's like, where it gets dangerous, right? Is I'm on this freeway. I like being on this freeway, but I want to be on that freeway as well. I'm not willing to move.
That one looks I want to be in both. I want to go to Sydney and Perth at the same time.
What is it? Second business syndrome?
It completely is. And it's interesting because I just look at it from that approach of, okay, well, you just have to understand what it really takes to be successful in it, and you can change. But the whole point is that there is nothing wrong with staying in a lane. There is nothing wrong with going, how can I make this lane wider? And there is nothing wrong with making a very deliberate, very logical jump to another lane or to another freeway in this example. Like you can, and I'm for it. The final point I am going to say is, if you think that your current lane is not going to be as good as some other lane, and so you go, oh, there's more opportunity over there, I'm going to be able to make more money over there, just look for the guys that are crushing it in your lane and you will get a real sense of realization of going, oh, I'm just not thinking. There are people in every industry, every type of business, every asset class. There are people doing shares, ETFs, property, residential, commercial, business, services, e-commerce, etc. Making
There's
millions,
many ways to crush
millions. And I'm just like, you are the limiting belief on that one. Like this whole concept of staying in my lane is not going to make me money. I don't believe
you
it.
find the idea of this, and it's whenever I look to the people that have been astronomically successful, and I mean astronomically, like Elon Musk, the Amazons and Bezos and Warren Buffett's, Bill Gates, did they diversify? How they got really successful is like they were very well diversified, Grant.
They did. Well, they did it.
Even Warren Buffett, there's this interesting stat, is like at one point he had like 70% of his fund money in American Express, one company. Ended up being obviously a very successful investment, but it's like, I just look at that and go, it's like interesting when you really look at how the Titans have been successful, and like I would be comparing their level of diversification. It's a fascinating idea.
But even to that point, I think that they're at this point now where their concept of diversification is slightly different, right? So if you look at Musk, he's across SpaceX.
That's the key.
But I actually think that for his leverage, he's just widened his lanes because he's just a marketing power. So his lane is just marketing like these crazy tech companies. So if you look at it from a different lens, there's potentially he's just looking at his lane and going, cool, I'm just turning this from 2 lanes to 4 lanes. It's not that he needs to run these businesses and do all these things. It's just he needs to have a mechanism to tell the world about it, and then they're going to have their life of their own, and that is his lane.
I disagree with that so much. When he did PayPal, for example.
That's correct. If you go to the PayPal, that's very.
And then you could make the argument that Bill Gates today and what he's doing with the Bill and Melinda Foundation and a ton of these other things. It's the same with Warren Buffett, right? And Bezos and all of them. They diversify more as they get deeper in the game. But when you look at how deep they were before they diversified what they were doing in business, it was deep. Like it wasn't it wasn't like they're going, do you know what, I've made it here. I've got to stop and just be very diversified.
Yeah, their step one was always master it. Once you've mastered one, you step into the next, and then you master the next one.
Of course, not financial advice.
What a good episode.
I'm not recommending that anyone single lanes their investments or business. Like seek out professionals, get good advice.
Just understand the lanes that you're in. And if you're trying to be in too many lanes, just remember that's, until you've built in those reps to your point, Charlie, and just being able to support it, it's not going to end nicely. It just needs to have that level of awareness. I'm going to wrap this one up, Charlie. It's been an awesome, awesome episode. Everyone who is tuning in, be sure to check out for our next episode that's coming up. I'm thoroughly looking forward to that one. And as well, if you're sitting here with more questions in the back of your head going, damn, I just wish I could ask Grant and Charlie these type of questions. There's 2 ways to submit them. First one is hit reply to Charlie's email. So he sends them out a couple of times a week and just ask your questions. We'll bring them up here. We'll answer them for you. Second one is head over to Facebook, join the Facebook group, which is Full Stack Business Owner Community. Ask your questions there, interact with the community, and we'll pick them up and talk about them in this episode. And now, if you do have people in your network, friends, family, etc., be sure to send this episode out to them if you think it would be valuable, as it will greatly assist us. And I just want to say thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to catching you on the next episode of Full Stack Business Owner.